Welcome back to the deep dive. When we usually think about loneliness as a theme in movies, we tend to picture these really dramatic, sweeping stories.
Yeah, that grand, tragic figure, totally isolated.
Exactly. But the sources you've brought us today point to something, well, something much quieter. We've got the Wikipedia entry on themes and production, some historical context, even raw audience reactions.
And they all point toward a kind of loneliness that is, I think, arguably more destructive because it's so quiet.
That's it. This deep dive is all about that pervasive feeling of isolation that just becomes routine, the unnoticed and quietly destructive kind of loneliness. And for that, we have to talk about maybe the definitive portrait of that experience, Taxi Driver from 1976.
It's a film that didn't just show loneliness. It felt like it captured the entire atmosphere of alienation in 1970s America.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission here is to get past the plot summary. We want to give you a really focused, reflective, and spoiler-free look at the film's core ideas.
Right. How it tapped into the 1970s, what people thought of it at the time.
And maybe most importantly, why its study of a man whose isolation just calcifies into routine is, well, it's still so profoundly relevant for us today.
We're looking for the specific intellectual nuggets from these sources. This isn't a film class summary.
So let's start at the very core of it, the anatomy of this unnoticed isolation. When you look at the themes section of the Wikipedia source, the central premise is. It's just fascinating because it isn't about tragedy in that big, dramatic way.
Yeah.
It's the idea that loneliness stops being an event. It becomes a destructive routine.
And the way the film establishes that routine is brilliant. Travis Bickle, our protagonist, is just constantly driving. He's moving through this labyrinth of Manhattan.
Literally inches away from millions of people.
The fares he picks up, the crowds on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
But he's completely anonymous, utterly disconnected.
The sources really highlight this one core mechanic, which
Yeah.
is observation versus participation.
Yes.
He is always watching life happen, the dates, the fights, the glamour, the grime. But the simple act of driving the cab makes him a perpetual outsider.
That taxi window. A critical analysis we looked at called it a moving barrier. It's physical, but it's also emotional. It just solidifies his role as this passive and pretty judgmental observer.
Yeah, and that passivity is so crucial. The Wikipedia theme section talks about how this routine, this constant observation without any participation, just lets resentment and judgment build up. There's no healthy outlet.
He's watching a world he desperately wants to be a part of. But every time he tries to connect, whether it's social or professional.
It's just awkwardness, rejection.
Exactly.
Right.
And each failure just reinforces the isolation.
Yeah.
Pushes him deeper into that routine.
I see that dynamic, the passive observation leading to this festering resentment. But how does the film make sure that's not just, static? What details from the production and theme sections show that shift from just watching to something more destructive?
That is where the physical environment becomes so important. The production details note that the decay, the seediness of 1970s New York City was absolutely essential.
So it wasn't just a set.
No, not at all. Martin Scorsese deliberately filmed in these gritty, genuinely dilapidated parts of the city. So the city itself, it starts to act as a mirror, but also as a kind of accelerant.
An accelerant. How do you mean?
Well, the environment reflects his internal state, right? His growing isolation, his moral decay. It's all mirrored in this physically and psychologically crumbling city all around him.
So it's not just a backdrop.
It's an active agent. It feeds his alienation. It feeds his need to, as he says, clean up the filth. One analysis suggests that because he's surrounded by all this visible decay, his own internal decay starts to feel justified. Normal, even.
And that shifts his routine from just observing the filth to feeling this obligation to get rid of it.
Exactly. It's a closed loop. The driving makes him isolated, the city reflects that isolation, and that feeling eventually pushes him toward action. It was this quiet psychological study that felt so chillingly real compared to, the big heroic movies of the mid-70s.
And that contrast leads us right into the historical context, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, this film landed at a moment of intense societal reckoning. We should probably shift focus now to that social mirror of the 1970s, pulling from our historical sources.
Yeah, you really have to understand the pressure cooker of that era. Our sources point to three big overlapping factors that made this film feel less like a story and more like a documentary. First up, profound urban decay.
Absolutely. New York City in the mid-70s was basically on the verge of fiscal collapse. Crime was rampant, infrastructure was failing, there was no public confidence.
So the city Travis drives through, grimy, dangerous, that wasn't an exaggeration.
Not at all. It was reality. The audience was seeing the city they actually lived in just through this magnified lens of psychological distress.
And then you layer on the psychological weight of the post-Vietnam era. The source material is very specific about this.
It is. You had this pervasive sense of national guilt, of confusion. Soldiers came home and often felt just completely disconnected, purposeless. Their skills were suddenly irrelevant or worse, stigmatized.
One of the critical analyses we looked at, maybe it was from the BFI retrospective, said that Travis Bickle embodies the emotional vacuum left by the war.
That's a perfect way to put it. He's a man defined by military training, by a need for structure, and he's dropped back into a society that has no structure or purpose for him. That resonated so deeply because it mirrored a national feeling of malaise.
And the last piece of that puzzle was the struggle with American masculinity. The old heroic models, John Wayne and all that, they'd either failed or been exposed as hypocritical.
And into that void steps a figure like Travis, who is desperate for some kind of rigid moral purpose, and he tries to fill that role himself no matter how misguidedly.
So this cocktail urban collapse, post-war trauma, and this crisis of masculinity, it made the film instantly recognizable. The critics weren't just reviewing a plot, they were reviewing a feeling.
Right. And our critical cultural source confirms that. Critics like Roger Ebert immediately got it. They saw the film as reflecting this era's pervasive sense of disillusionment and moral ambiguity.
So the sources positioned it as this defining document of 70s cinema precisely because it gave a face to the era's anxiety. But it wasn't all praise, was it? Our sources mentioned controversy over the ending. Did that dilute the message for some people?
It absolutely raised questions. I mean, the film was lauded for its artistry, but the ending's ambiguity, is it redemptive? Is it all in his head? Is it just cynical? That caused a lot of debate.
Some people saw it as too neat of a solution.
A very violent but clean solution. And that seemed to contradict the messy, unresolved feeling of the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
But the dominant critical view, which is in the reception notes, was that the ambiguity was the whole point. You can't just neatly clean up the kind of destruction that's born from routine isolation.
And that visceral connection is what made the film so powerful and sometimes so uncomfortable. It really raises a question for you, the listener. If you were there in 1976, watching this, seeing your city and your generation's struggles reflected so vividly, how much of it would feel less like a movie and more like a document of your own anxiety? Let's transition from that intellectual critique to how audiences actually felt, using those top user reviews we pulled from IMDb. Because the critics praised the structure, but the audience response was, it was so emotional, so
The
personal.
language they use is incredibly revealing. They don't just say the film is lonely. The words that keep coming up are alienation, claustrophobic experience, and psychological impact.
Yeah.
One person wrote that watching the film felt like being trapped inside a cement box with a ticking clock.
Wow. That's a huge difference. It's the gap between understanding a character is lonely and being forced to feel lonely with him.
Yes, through his unreliable perspective. The sources really stress that you're not just observing Travis. You are seeing the world through his paranoid, isolated filter.
Yeah.
The film forces that shift in perspective.
It's unsettling.
Deeply unsettling. It resonated because it validated these quiet, often unspoken fears of disconnection so many people felt. It exposed the instability just lurking beneath the surface of routine life. That idea that you could be surrounded by millions of people and still be the loneliest person on earth.
So the critics are praising the artistry and the social commentary, cementing its place in film history. But the audience is having this visceral, emotional, and profoundly uncomfortable reaction.
Because of that raw psychological authenticity, it was a confrontation, not just a movie you watch.
And that confrontation, it forced people to recognize the cost of being unnoticed, not just by the world, but by yourself. It showed that alienation, when it calcifies into a routine, it doesn't just go away. It turns inward, and then eventually it erupts.
Which brings us to its legacy.
Exactly. What does this all mean for us today? Let's look at his lasting influence, drawing from the legacy section of the Wikipedia source. This film didn't just document the anxiety of the 70s, it fundamentally changed how we tell stories about the disturbed anti-hero.
The influence is profound. I mean, the sources confirm Taxi Driver just altered screenwriting, it altered acting, it established a template for exploring a character's internal dialogue, using voiceover, showing that slow mental decay.
It's the masterpiece of American psychological realism.
It paved the way for pretty much every dark, nuanced character study that came after it.
But is that legacy entirely positive? I mean, don't the sources also suggest that Maybe unintentionally, the film created a flawed template, this romanticization of the alienated male antihero.
That is an absolutely necessary nuance to bring up. The film is brilliant, but its portrait was so powerful that it led to imitation that, well, it missed the point.
Right.
Later films would sometimes copy the style, the isolation, the resentment, but without the deep psychological roots or the social commentary of the original. So its legacy is two-sided. It's a high watermark for character studies, but it also inadvertently became the blueprint for a sometimes simplistic archetype.
Which makes that original message about routine, unnoticed loneliness even more critical for us to understand today. So if we connect that 1976 concept to modern life, how does it stack up?
I'd say it's even more urgent now. The isolation Travis felt was rooted in physical decay and social breakdown. Today, we're facing digital isolation, the pressure of performative connection.
We're connected 24/7 technologically, but emotionally.
So many feel adrift. The physical barrier of that cab window has been replaced by the digital barrier of the screen.
It's the exact same dynamic of observation versus participation. Back then, it was driving through the city, watching other people live. Now, it's endless scrolling,
Yeah.
witnessing everyone else's curated lives, their curated happiness, without ever really connecting ourselves.
And that difference is key. Travis Bickle felt invisible in a broken city. Today, people can feel invisible in a world of constant visible noise. The film's core question, what happens when isolation becomes a destructive routine? It's more pressing now because the triggers for that isolation are everywhere all the time.
That makes perfect sense. So to bring it all back home, Taxi Driver is still crucial, not just as a great piece of filmmaking, but because it took routine, unnoticed loneliness, something that's usually in the background of a story, and it made it the absolute central focus.
It captured a specific historical moment perfectly, the malaise of the 70s, but it also defined this timeless psychological state that we're still grappling with. It gave a name and an urgency to the quiet destruction of disconnection.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on, based on everything our sources have revealed. If the film showed us how corrosive, unnoticed loneliness can be, what subtle, routine feelings of isolation are we overlooking right now in our own environment?
I mean, think about it. Endless scrolling, the normalization of hyper-individualized remote work.
What pressures might be building from those things that could lead to unexpected, maybe even corrosive consequences down the road?
I think we all need to consider the distinction between necessary solitude, which is restorative, something you choose, and quiet social destruction, which is corrosive and routine. Recognizing that difference is maybe the most vital lesson the film still has for us today.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We hope this gave you a new lens to view not just the film, but maybe your own relationship with your environment and those routine moments of isolation it might contain. We'll see you next time.